Hi there, my name is Sam Alexander, and I'm from JScan Consulting. You started at the bottom, and now you're here. Today we'll be discussing the Employee Handbook and the importance of the Employee Handbook to answer our research question, which is, how can the written rules of a handbook impact the legal, rational authority of managers in an organization such as Shoppers Drug Mart? We're going to be starting with some case studies, including Shoppers Drug Mart, and then we're going to draw some comparisons from other companies. We're going to go through some advantages, disadvantages of the Employee Handbook, and finally talk about some content from the chapter that relates to our topic. We'll finish with a conclusion and an application of what we learned. Thank you.
My name is Cameron, and I'm also here on behalf of JScan Consulting. Now, an employee handbook can have a ton of different components. It can talk about the policies and the overall mission and vision of an organization. It can talk about the benefits, and it can talk about some of the procedures an organization follows in dealing with its employees, but it can also talk about the rules and procedures that employees have to follow on a day-to-day basis. Now, the rules and regulations in an employee handbook relates to Principle 6 of bureaucracy, which you can find in Chapter 5 of your textbook, which says that administrative acts, decisions, and rules should be formulated and put in writing. Exactly what happens with an employee handbook.
So why Shoppers, you might ask? Well, we have good connections with some employees that have worked at Shoppers in the past and have gone through the Employee Handbook of Shoppers Drug Mart. So we were able to collect first source data from interviewing these employees.
So another case that we looked into was General Mills, and this was in our textbook in Chapter 5. General Mills basically opened up Chinese restaurants, and the managers weren't properly enforcing the rules and regulations within their handbooks, and so their numbers started to decline due to poor quality in prep, service, and food. So what they decided to do was to make a mandatory 4-month training for managers going into the restaurants, and then by doing this, they're enforcing rules and regulations amongst the managers through these 4 months, and then they are able to elaborate on that and put it into the restaurants that they're opening. Then they decided to develop a new line of management that consisted of regional managers. This was to better help the future enforcement of rules and regulations, and by doing this, they added a structure of hierarchy, making the organization taller in order to enforce the rules and regulations within their handbook.
When finding information on our research topic, we reached out to many people that worked at Shoppers Drug Mart, one of which is one of our friends, Steve Collier. He's been the supervisor at the Spring Garden Shoppers Drug Mart and also worked at Shoppers Drug Mart back home. When asking him about the Employee Handbook and the rules of the Employee Handbook at Shoppers Drug Mart, he commented and said that it's not heavily enforced, there's nothing very specific in it, and it's just a general guideline that they're told to review by managers upon being hired into Shoppers Drug Mart. Now, looking at various case studies, we've come to the conclusion that this is the case in many businesses. They very broad information and they just present it to you and it gets left there. But if you look at specific industries such as manufacturing, this is where the Employee Handbook comes into more play. In one of the situations, there was a weld line where the Employee Handbook outlined the certain characteristics of that job for the weld line only. There was also a stamping section to this manufacturing plant, which had its own handbook and was clearly outlined in the handbook. Now, this only brought information that each employee might not have known, and if they were to switch places, they would have to go through and review the Employee Handbook. This is where the Employee Handbook is more effective.
Another way that an employee handbook helps out managers, specifically with their legal rational authority, is that employees knowing what their managers expect in terms of their day-to-day procedures means that they actually contribute better to manager goals. Obviously, having a handbook which tells employees how to react to a given situation or details a certain procedure means that they will have increased confidence in their own performance. It also allows employees to get a sense of the organizational culture by reading through a handbook and seeing the day-to-day procedures and the rules that they are to follow. They can accurately gauge their manager's expectations before even starting their first day at the organization. Another advantage of having an employee handbook is that it greatly reduces the risk to the manager. The manager can point to the employee handbook and say, hey, the detailed procedure for what you were supposed to do is in here. And you signed a contract which said that you read and agreed to the content of the employee handbook. In this way, it greatly reduces their own personal liability as a manager.
We just wanted to touch base on an advantage that came straight from our text in Chapter 5, which consists of written rules regarding possible reward or punishments of employees, such as termination or promotion. This makes it clear on what their consequences or what enables them to move further in the business. It makes it clear to all employees. It can also reduce costs of enforcement and evaluating employee performance.
And finally, the last thing our research uncovered in terms of advantages is that an employee handbook satisfies the human need for structure. And in doing so, it gives the manager a ton of legal rational power. The manager's authority in the hierarchical organization is cemented, and the employee is subordinate. Now, this can actually be a disadvantage, as we'll talk about a little bit further into our presentation, but it does certainly help when the employee has something very simple to do and the manager needs it to be done quickly as per procedure. They can point to the handbook and say, look, you need to do this. This is the structure of the organization that you signed on for.
So now that we've heard about some advantages of written rules in a handbook, I'm going to talk about some disadvantages. So one of the first disadvantages is that handbooks are often costly and very difficult to implement. The reason that they can be difficult to implement is that formal communication cannot cover all the eventualities that often arise in an organization. Informal communication, such as talking to a coworker or a manager, conveys cultural values that a handbook simply cannot. Therefore, formal communication is often less reliable than informal communication. Handbooks also inspire conformity, strain creative thinking, and lower employee morale. For example, a rulebook cannot sometimes assume that managers don't trust their employees, and also limits an employee's autonomy to make day-to-day decisions in their work. This is extremely important in a dynamic industry. Handbooks can also take away a manager's legal rational power, as their day-to-day decisions could be undermined if they decided to go against the rulebook. So now that we've talked about some disadvantages of written rules in a handbook, we're going to talk about some alternative approaches to fix these problems.
Alright, so finally we wanted to touch on an alternative to the kind of handbook used by Shoppers Drug Mart, in which rules and procedures are heavily codified and written down, and there exists a very formal structure. Instead, we wanted to look at the Nordstrom Employee Handbook, back from the mid-90s. Now, Nordstrom's employee handbook consists of a single page, as opposed to the Shoppers Handbook, which is obviously much more than just one page. And the interesting thing about the Nordstrom employee handbook is that there's only one codified procedure, and that is exercise your best judgment in every situation. Now, there are many advantages and disadvantages to the way Nordstrom does things in terms of its employee handbook. Some of the advantages would be that employees have increased responsibility. They can feel empowered. They can make their own decisions, and that kind of positive power, do whatever you want, we have faith in you, that Nordstrom expresses, is fundamentally different from the message that the Shoppers Handbook sends, which is, do things this exact way, this is the right way to do things. Now, the disadvantage to a system such as this, with a one-page employee handbook, is obviously that Nordstrom can't really define its procedures. So if there's something specific that an employee needs to do, or something that requires precision, this employee handbook doesn't help at all. It doesn't actually list any codified procedures for the kind of day-to-day tasks any Nordstrom employee would have to complete. So there are definitely alternatives to the kind of employee handbook that Shoppers has, and each of them does offer its own specific advantages and disadvantages. So, to conclude this video as a whole, Julie is now going to be talking to you about the conclusion and what we learned. Thank you.
So far, what we have learned through our case studies is that it is up to the managers to enforce norms as well as the procedures in the handbook. The advantages of the handbook is that it gives structure and clearly defined roles for employees to know what to do in certain situations. But there's also disadvantages. The disadvantage is that culture is not always explicit, and it's up to the managers to be a role model and enforce those norms. Also, it limits the autonomy if the rulebook is too strict for the managers as well as the employees. In conclusion, we found that there is strong evidence that the codification of rules and procedures into an employee handbook has a really large impact on the legal rational authority of managers. And as managers, we will stress that it is not so much the rulebook or the handbook, but the content inside the handbook that will change the structure of your organization. Thank you.
Now we here. Started